It certainly did, so thank you very much. We're going to bring the focus now back home to KiwiRail, and I think that Professor McNaughton has set the challenge to KiwiRail. It would be fair to say that KiwiRail has had its fair share of challenges, but as we heard in the budget last year, and as Minister Shane Jones reiterated, they've had in the region of $1 to $1.5 billion in the latest forecast period to revitalise rail. So what is KiwiRail's vision for the future? Please welcome the Group Chief Executive of KiwiRail, Greg Miller.
Mihi mai kia mātou katoa, kua tai mai nei tēnei rā. Welcome everybody who's joined us here today, and thank you for coming to hear about KiwiRail's story about building a nation and connecting our nation. Delighted to share with you a few things. In Māoridom, there's a whakatauki that we refer to that says kamua kamuri. And what that says is we walk backwards into the future. So we look to our past in order to understand what we're going to do that's new and different. And what I'd like to do is just reflect for a few minutes, if I can, on the things that the railway entity in New Zealand has traversed. First of all, the founding father, Sir Julius Vogel, for us. About 157 years ago, the first horse-drawn carriage worked across parts of the South Island. But in the late 1800s, when Julius Vogel was treasurer, he travelled to the UK and borrowed £10 million to establish what I would probably call the first provincial growth fund. And in doing that, he had some interesting comments. He probably talks a bit like Andrew in some degree, but he said, New Zealand is a peculiar country. You cannot get over its geographical challenges and configuration. You cannot bring together the two ends nearer than they are, and there will always be a certain amount of isolation in different parts until the iron horse runs through these islands. An interesting comment. So in his first decade as Premier, he set about a task of using the £10 million that he'd raised to build 1,900 kilometres of rail track, a significant outcome with a hell of a lot of hard work from our immigrant labour force newly arrived in New Zealand. In the history of our network, in 1862, the first rail line opened in 157 years ago, funnily enough, in Nelson, a horse-drawn carriage to the port. The first steam train arrived in 1863 in Christchurch to Littleton. In 1873, the first North Island, Auckland to Onehunga line opened. In 1880, 1,900 kilometres of railway was established across New Zealand. In 1886, the Wellington Manawatu Railway Corporation established its first corridor from Longburn to Palmerston North, introducing the new revelation of gas-lit dining cars. In 1908, the North Island Main Trunk Line opened after 23 years of construction. As infrastructure players like you are, that's no mean feat. 23 years through the Shaky Isles. In 1923, the West Coastline opened the Otira Tunnel, 8.5 kilometres of magic, the longest in the British Empire at its time, and the nation's first piece of electric railway. In 1945, the South Island Main Trunk opened between Christchurch and Picton. In 1953, it hit an all-time peak of 5,656 kilometres of rail. When we think about the development in our regions, Sir Julius Vogel's vision was the first PGF fund to allow manufacturers and exports in New Zealand GDP to develop. He was called a pork barrel politician for taking care of European and British orientated manufacturers, but very quickly after this 5,600 kilometres of infrastructure build, he was seen as the visionary that he is. Moving forward to today's story, we look on and we see in 1962 the introduction of the first roll-on, roll-off rail ferry, the way we connected State Highway 1 on road and rail between our two islands. The last regular steam train ran in 1871. If I just go, excuse me. What we see with this train here, this picture here was of the parliamentary rail service that ran the North Island Main Trunk Line for the first time. And when we look forward, we see a mean feat built with the opening of the Kaimai Tunnel in 1978. The electrification of the North Island Main Trunk Line was completed in 1984 at a cost of $250 million. If only they spent double that and got Auckland and Wellington connected, how happy we'd all be. There's been a number of highs and lows in our sector. A number of you would recall the development in 2006 of the government-funded project, $1.6 billion, to modernise the electrification of commuter rail. And it's fabulous to see in 2 decades 100 million rail journeys across Auckland City and 30 million rail journeys across Wellington. But we've had our challenges too. We see what happened to us in 2016 with Kaikoura, a $550 million repair job for the rail network to re-establish itself. That's a bit about the past, and I want to talk about the future. I get a lot of questions about how we're going to use the hard-earned taxpayers' dollars, and I want to share some of that with you today. So as we look to the future, we see a railway that's more focused on intermodal. We're establishing more freight hubs across the country for logs, for containers, for dairy, for meat, for fish, for agriculture, aquaculture, and all types of our GDP exports. In the top left-hand corner, we talk about intermodal development and the inland ports. The Port of Auckland establishing itself in Te Rapa, closely followed by the Port of Tauranga establishing itself in Ruakura, and KiwiRail's operation sitting at Te Rapa also. I know Mr. Wayne Brown's here, and I encourage Wayne to get the third paper of the Upper North Island Supply Chain Committee study out for everybody, because another story is the more we consolidate our port behaviour, the better New Zealand is and the better our railway is. So how do we use the $1 billion that we've been gifted by the Crown on behalf of New Zealand? There's a few things we'd like to share. The first one being we've got great support. We've got great support from the Coalition, and every minister has their scenario of benefits for New Zealand, whether they're regional economic growth, commuter metro rail services, a nation of capability for growing GDP, and a nation that's connected. And I want to talk you through exactly how we're going to use that capital. One of the first key things that we're doing is our ferries are ageing, and there comes a time when the ferries need to retire. That's not far away for us. So $35 million is going to be spent on upgrading the ferry strategy inter-island. That's taking 3 ships down to 2 very large vessels, something close to 210 metres long, 31 metres wide, up from 150 metre long vessels. We've just started the design and advanced procurement of that project, and we've started the tender for our design partners, and we're looking for the build partner as we speak. We're looking to have these vessels in service by 2023. It's about a $500 million project at sea, and when you change the ship, you have to change the landside terminals. That's about another $300 million. We're also looking hard at replacing our rolling stock. And with the rolling stock question, when you look at the benefits of rail, what also comes with that is the environmental answer that's needed for the future. All too ready, we're hearing more and more about the environment and the green need to take care of our nation. So replacing our rolling stock's not an easy question. We've got 100 locos that need replacement now, and some of those date back to the 60s. But do we go for modern diesel, or do we do some mix of diesel and electric? You may hear more from us in the new year about a strategy we're calling Hydro Rail, taking the benefits of our rivers produced energy and turning that into a nation that has more electrification. As Andrew would attest, it's a strategy global, but New Zealand's still sitting in the post-steam era with the use of diesel. So Hydro Rail is something we're going to look very closely at, especially along the North Island Main Trunk Line and East Coast Corridor to the Port of Tauranga. We're going to repurpose some of our wagons. We've got 2,000 wagons that we aim to replace and upgrade, and that frees up some of our old container flat tops to become log-bolstered wagons for a second life. We've also got significant tunnel work, significant work to go into the infrastructure and bridges across the 4,000 kilometres currently operating, and developing that to a standard that keeps our speed, because schedule integrity for us equals market share. We're going to put some new handling equipment into our intermodal terminals, and we're going to upgrade the freight reservation systems to take our customers on this journey. The Provincial Growth Fund has been good to us, and we've had to work hard to unlock the value that Minister Jones has. There's a significant amount of projects that we're taking New Zealand through in the provinces, and we're working with government at the moment on how to best utilise the $300 million allocated for rail development, whether it's in the West Coast, a Dannyverk log siding development, a Kawerau distribution hub, reinvigorating the Hillside Engineering Depot so we have heavy lift capability in the South Island in 2 locations, not one, for resilience but also employment. And at Hillside, developing a centre of excellence in engineering that supports our industry. We're also looking close at the tourism business. In our tourism business, New Zealand has just over 3.5 million tourists. We handle about 1 million visitors a year on our trains and on our ferries, and we deliver significant value to the provinces that our tourism trains run to. But the carriages are aged, there is no class separation, and the platforms aren't big enough to take longer trains of tourism. It's a growth area for us, so with the Coastal Pacific Railway running Picton to Christchurch and the Transalpine, we're putting $80 million, 40 into each, to upgrade the services and build a bigger booking system for our customers. We're looking hard at the inland freight hub in Palmerston North, a place for the future for us to develop what we believe will be the future look of inland freight terminals. The railway used to be at the centre of every main city, and as we grow, so too do the communities around the city. There comes a time when we have to move. So we'll exit Tremaine Ave, release that land for better use for the Manawatu region, and we're looking at Bunnythorpe, you may have heard about. There's a $40 million PGF fund development for that, and first of all we acquire the land, and on the back of that we can see 8 businesses that we can bring to that site, whether it's log marshalling, containers management for intermodal exports, a domestic freight hub for the tolls and the main freights of the world, a logistics park for our major FMCG manufacturers and importers, along with a rail marshalling, stevedoring and mechanical workshop. A big plan for rail in the Manawatu. You would have also recently heard that we reopened the Napier I Raw Line. There was $6 million granted to that from the Crown, and there will be 2 log trains running every weekend starting at the end of September. Those trains we move up from Whanganui and Dunyvik and give them weekend work. You also may have heard about the development in Whanganui and rail upgrades there. There's $3 million to improve that infrastructure. There's a number of growing exporters from that region, and they want connectivity to the ports of Wellington and the newly listed ports of Napier. More funding for the Wellington Metro, not specifically from the PGF at all, but from other Crown investment. We aim to increase the capability of the overhead traction services, double tracking Trentham to Upper Hutt, and rehabilitation of the Wairarapa line, a $300 million investment that we aim to complete by 2023. Some of you would be involved with that with us. Minister Twyford talked about the funding between Auckland and Hamilton. There's $40 million dedicated over the next 5 years for that. I find this project pretty interesting, to connect the Greater Waikato with planning change to allow property development adjacent to the railway line simply says we're going back to learn from the past in a great way. When we look at Auckland property prices sort of ranging from $2,000 a metre for residential and $600 a metre for industrial land, it's kind of crazy. It's very hard for Auckland to develop and grow unless we unlock through critical infrastructure like rail the benefit for the provinces. So we're excited about this, and this will be the middle of next year the first commuter service starts. And we're going to look hard at Waitoa, Kinleith, Te Awamutu and Huntly services in and out of Hamilton. There's currently 40,000 cars a day on those roads, and it's a big challenge for those people. Other funding, we know a bit about the CRL, and I'm sure a lot of you are involved with that. I think it's a fabulous project. It certainly joins Western Southern heavy rail lines. Like the Waterview Tunnel, once it's built, we're going to say to Sean and his team, thank you very much, but we're so glad we did this, because you wouldn't want to change back. The business cases are being developed for a third mainline south that you heard from the Minister today, and that's the Papakura to Pukekohe electrification, and we're looking very hard about what we do and into the Waikato. The future of rail, for us, there's a great paper that's come together with a lot of hard work across multi-agencies, MOT-centred, KiwiRail involved, Treasury and of course the shareholding ministers. But the government's plan for the future for us is a big one. The future of rail will give us a 10-year plan of solid investment. This business has suffered, it's been a can kicked down the road all too often, but globally rail resurgence is done for many reasons. There's environmental reasons, trucks off the road, emissions targets to be hit, safety components, but there's also a business that supports GDP and supports commuter productivity. The 10-year rail plan we look forward to sharing, because it will give us the bridge capital to allow us to build a future plan for New Zealand. There's another component that's quite exciting for us, and ably led by the former Mayor of the Far North, Wayne Brown. This plan is a Upper North Island Supply Chain Committee, which we're part of, to look hard at what happens with the future of the ports of Auckland. I totally respect the board and the leadership of the ports of Auckland and have worked with them a long time, but the ratepayers of Auckland, with close to a $500 million a year subsidy to that land asset, you'd wonder why, when that land could be used for so many other things and unlock so much more value for those ratepayers in the city. So this report actually is quite important because it's a future look, like other countries have done, about how we join our supply chain infrastructure for the betterment of our importer and exporter. It's not all about the immediacy of capital. Like we heard from Andrew, it's the future generations that we're working on behalf of, and this paper will hopefully enlighten New Zealand of considerations from other countries, but the things that we need to be conscious of in our country. And unlocking the value of the Far North is a logical place to look. The first thing I'd like to say, and probably the last thing on this report, is that it's truly the first independent study done. The prior reports were done not with agendas, but with outcomes from their funders sought. This one is independent because the Crown has assembled people without a bias. We're putting a plan together that looks at what's best for New Zealand Inc. The last thing I'd say before I leave is that wherever the port goes, luckily the railway's got to go first. Thank you. Kia ora.